It came through the mail, just weeks after 9/11. New terror attacks. First in Florida, then New York and Washington. Anthrax. It spread fear and panic through the nation.
2 media offices and a Microsoft office received letters containing anthrax. 1 man is dead, 2 people are being treated for the infection.
Someone had mailed letters laced with the deadly powder to the media and to U.S. senators.
President Bush said he could not rule out that Osama bin Laden is behind the scare.
And for the first time in modern history, the United States Congress was shut down. 5 people were killed, 22 infected, and the whole country filled with foreboding.
The letters sent to NBC and the New York Post were the same. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great. The letter sent to Senator Tom Daschle had similar wording. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? Death to America, death to Israel. Allah is great.
If you think about it, the attack was against all of us, that it went into the mail system, so that means it had the potential for spores to be delivered into anybody's home.
Fear of anthrax infected the American psyche and was crucial in justifying the war against Iraq.
The second phase, if I could just mention very quickly, the second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I emphasize may, have come from Iraq.
Oh, is that right?
If that may be the case, then that's when some tough decisions are going to have to be made too.
The anthrax attacks were meant to lead to an invasion of Iraq, just like 9/11 led to the invasion of Afghanistan. However, unlike 9/11, the anthrax attacks were recognized by the FBI as a false flag.
When they looked at the FBI's spores, they were stunned. All of them came from a single strain of anthrax, the Ames strain.
We were surprised it was the Ames strain, and it was chilling at the same time.
The Ames strain finds its origin in the United States, and enemies of America could not have had access to it. The FBI concluded that the anthrax attacks had a domestic perpetrator.
It appeared the FBI was looking for a lone killer, and they soon zeroed in on a person of interest, an Army biodefense scientist named Stephen Hatfield.
I am not the anthrax killer.
Charges were never laid, yet Hatfield continued to be harassed by the FBI and hounded by the media.
I object to an investigation characterized, as this one has been, by outrageous official statements, calculated leaks to the media, and causing a feeding frenzy operating to my great prejudice.
The FBI was hoping to find physical evidence that tied Hatfield to the mailing, specifically stray anthrax spores. But inside the apartments of both Hatfield and his girlfriend, there were no telltale spores or equipment that could have been used to produce anthrax.
What the FBI ultimately couldn't find was a spore or any kind of evidence that he had carried this out.
Investigators had come to believe Hatfield somehow had produced the deadly anthrax powder in an improvised underwater lab.
Engineers are draining a Maryland pond today,
looking for evidence related to the anthrax attacks.
Almost 1.5 million gallons.
The pond is a huge undertaking that will take 3 to 4 weeks and cost about $250,000.
I think the draining of the pond is the most outstanding example of really Looney Tunes behavior. Instead of whatever kind of deliberate investigatory techniques should have been used.
It would take nearly 5 years before Hatfield was officially cleared. He won a $5.8 million judgment against the United States government for invasion of privacy.
Next, the FBI used genetic markers to compare the spores in the letters to the anthrax in U.S. labs.
The FBI believed the deadly spores matched one particular flask of liquid anthrax labeled RMR 1029. More than 100 people had access to the flask, but the FBI decided to focus on one, the primary custodian, their own consultant, Dr. Bruce Ivins.
The FBI insinuated that Bruce did this in a week in the laboratory at nights, and we all knew that that was in fact reasonable. It wasn't practical, and given the limitations of the laboratory, it just wasn't possible in that time frame.
Ivins' colleagues also insist it would have been impossible for him to produce the powder unnoticed.
People notice things that are unusual in the suites. They find out what's going on. Somebody would ask him, Bruce, what experiment's going on? What are you doing here? Your life depends on questions like that. And so it's just he couldn't have, in my opinion, known that he would not be observed.
And the FBI did not find any physical evidence, spores or remnants of anthrax DNA, on the equipment they believe Ivins used to make the powder. Ivins' mental health was fragile. The FBI psychiatrist was warning, too much pressure could push him over the edge. They sent in special teams and sealed off the house.
They execute search warrants at his house, for his cars, at the daughter's apartment, everywhere. And freeze wrap his cars and cart them away, essentially looking for any hint of anthrax.
But there were no anthrax spores to be found, not in his car and not in his house.
The AP has learned that Ivins told friends the government stalked him and his family for months, even offering his son $2.5 million to rat him out. Ivins also believed investigators tried to turn his hospitalized daughter against him by showing her photographs of dead anthrax victims.
At the end, Bruce Ivins was a wreck. But he wouldn't confess to being the anthrax killer.
Under this kind of pressure, Stephen Hatfield called a press conference and denied that he was the guy. Bruce Ivins is not made of such stern stuff. And it is clear from records that we can now have access to, his emails and so on, that Bruce Ivins begins to crumble. He is not strong enough to withstand this kind of pressure. And he begins to spiral downward.
A year and a half after the FBI first started investigating him, Bruce Ivins took a large dose of Tylenol PM. It destroyed his liver and shut down his kidneys. He collapsed in the bathroom.
He clearly can't take it anymore, and he chooses a very terrible way to die. Downs a bottle of Tylenol. And it has to have been a slow, agonizing death.
He would die in the hospital a few days later.
And after nearly 7 years, the FBI finally convicts somebody for the anthrax attacks. Of course, they never tried him in court or charged him. They've just announced he did it, and he's not commenting since he's dead. The government declares Dr. Bruce Ivins as the only person responsible for those anthrax attacks, despite an admitted lack of any direct evidence.
But the genetic evidence linking the anthrax to Ivins' flask wasn't conclusive.
The FBI was asking an independent board of scientists to review the crucial piece of their evidence. That flask, they believed, was the murder weapon, RMR 1029.
They're looking into the science that the FBI used to
What does this report mean for the FBI investigation?
When the report was finally released, there was a surprise.
It is not possible to reach a definitive conclusion about the origins of the B. anthracis in the mailings based on the scientific evidence alone.
In a carefully worded statement, the National Academy of Sciences questioned the FBI's assertion that Ivins' flask was the murder weapon.
The scientific data alone do not support the strength of the government's repeated assertions that RMR 1029 was conclusively identified as the parent material to the anthrax powder used in the mailings.
In fact, Ivins' flask can be excluded as the source of the anthrax.
The differences between those letters and the flask RMR 1029 indicate that there had to be an additional growth step from RMR 1029 in order to create letters with the characteristics that they found.
The deadly bacterial spores, mailed to victims in the U.S. anthrax attacks, scientists say, share a chemical fingerprint that is not found in bacteria from the flask linked to Bruce Ivans, the biodefense researcher implicated in the crime. The anthrax was so sophisticated that it could not have been produced at Fort Detrick.
That was liquid anthrax in that flask. Even if the FBI can tie it to that flask, they can't explain how it was then made into this extremely sophisticated type of weapon with small milligrammage, with electric charges to it, with polyglass on top of the coating, all to go deep inside the lungs to spray into the air. This was weaponized military anthrax.
Many experts agreed. The anthrax in the 2001 letter attacks was the most sophisticated they had ever seen.
The material literally would float and waft within the bag, for instance, and when anyone brought a hand near the bag, a lot of these spores would migrate towards the hand.
They knew this highly floatable anthrax was something special.
I'm fully convinced, as are other experts, not alone by any chance, that Dr. Ivans could not have done this with the equipment that he had. The material that was in the Dashon Leahy letter, according to FBI releases, was 1.5 to 3 microns in particle size. This was super sophisticated. To get 1.5 to 3 microns mass median diameter is phenomenal. I contend that that kind of powder could not be made at Fort Detrick because they don't have the equipment necessary to get down to that particle size with that kind of refinement.
The FBI wasn't even able to figure out how it was made. A further indication of production in an advanced laboratory is that the anthrax had been produced in 2 separate batches.
There were 2 letters that were suspicious that both arrived on the same day. One contained a white talcum powdery-like substance. The other contained a brownish, granular, almost sandy-like substance.
Those differences indicate 2 main things. One is that they were separate batches. They have enough physical and chemical differences between the 2 sets of letters that they must have come from 2 separate batches.
Let's recap the information. The anthrax was made in a professional laboratory, so the attacks must have been state-sponsored. The anthrax was of the Ames strain, so it couldn't have been the work of an enemy of the United States. The anthrax did not come from Ivan's flask. And this flask was the closest match of the anthrax in the U.S. This means that the anthrax attacks were not an inside job. An unsolvable mystery? No. It means the anthrax attacks were done by an ally of the United States.
It emerged that the Ames strain had been shared with labs in other countries.
So I began to look who had the means of and the availability of the Ames strain abroad, which labs, were there any labs that could have done this? You couldn't limit this to America and exclude every place else because it was available in England, in Canada, in many foreign countries.
But it wasn't the United Kingdom, and it wasn't Canada. It also wasn't Sweden. Because their anthrax had been investigated too. There is another U.S. ally, which also has the Ames strain.
Our strategic ally, our unbreakable friendship, and our cultural brother, the only democracy in the Middle East, the State of Israel.
Israel has an offensive biological weapons program. It has not signed the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits their production. Israel also had a clear motive. The attacks conveyed that the enemies of Israel and America are the same. And these enemies are Islamic terrorists. Israel would clearly benefit from an American invasion of Iraq.
I believe and I know that I speak and reflect the sentiment of not just the majority, but the overwhelming majority of Israelis in supporting a preemptive strike against Saddam's regime. And this cuts across political lines in Israel.
It were Israeli security sources that pointed to Iraq. Israel was the only country with a motive, and the only country with the means. Israel did the anthrax attacks. In 2003, an Israeli woman smuggled anthrax into the United States. The central terminal of LaGuardia Airport was evacuated. It happened Friday, when a gas mask and white powder were found in an Israeli woman's bag. She was traveling from Israel to Texas. The first test came up positive for anthrax, but a second test proved negative. The Port Authority for New York and New Jersey eventually cleared the bag. But it is clear that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey cannot be trusted.
It's interesting to note that the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan is owned and operated by the Port Authority.
That's right.